as I've said previously, I think I do the list of the talks I'd like to give or want to do each month a year in advance. So I've just finished preparing the talks for next year in terms of titles, and and sometimes I don't look at the titles again until the month before I come to do it, and I kind of realise, heck, over this last year, some of these titles have been huge in terms of the things that we can cover. So this is going to be a whistle stop tour through the end of the world. Partly because I'm interested in end of days prophecies and Armageddon and all that jazz. And there's a personal connection to something I'll share with you in a moment. So that's the journey. It's going to be a stop starty, and it's only meant to get you thinking about stuff you'd like to look up if you choose to. So let's start with a biblical uh, quotation about the end of the world. And there's some stuff in this quotation I think is really interesting. You know, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, and so on. I think the first four um, things there could apply to a number of politicians, maybe, um, and could apply to a number of people. We actually see this increase in self awareness, sorry, self focusedness. And I look around and I wonder where are the people that are carers and givers, apart from the people on this call, of course, your carers and givers. And I think when we look at the state of world and the state of what people think are important these days, you know, TikTok likes and you know all this kind of stuff that we think is important. It's worth looking at these quotes and looking at where we're at. The other quote I like about the end of days is this one, which is not a real quote, but it is a quote because it's a quoting what somebody wrote and said, but it's not an historical quote. And when I first saw the film The Omen, which I love my horror films, I'm sorry, I do love my horror films. Um, this quote, when the Jews return to Zion and the comet fills the sky and the Holy Roman Empire rises, then you and I must die. From the eternal sea he rises, creating armies on either shore, turning man against his brother, till man exists no more. It's a clever bit of writing. I don't think there's any historical connection to this apart from the film. But just just think a moment about the state of the world. There are things in that poem now that we can immediately point to. Um, the Arab conflict, if you like, when a comet fills the sky, we've got that new comet that's coming in, this extraterrestrial comet that's flying through our solar system at the moment, which I wrote about in a blog quite recently, which is being seen as son of Armageddon. From the eternal sea he rises. Well, the eternal sea is often interpreted as politics. From the political world he rises, creating armies on either shore. I could read so much of current news into that um, simple poem that I could convince myself the end of the world is nigh. But this has a personal connection, which I'll share with you right now. That little lad among the crosses is the little actor that played in the original film The Omen. The remake is nowhere near as good, but the original film The Omen, the 76 film, had this little lad called Harvey Stevens playing Damien Thorne as a young child. And Damien Thorne, or should I say Harvey Stevens, was a little lad that actually was from South East London. And his parents were really into pushing both him, his daughter and himself into theatre, don't you know, lovely? And Damien Thorne, Harvey Stevens, that's his name, I taught the little perisher. When I was teaching in London, he went to the comprehensive school they taught in, and he'd done the film, obviously, by the time I was teaching. He'd done the film. He was now a kind of grumpy, antichrist like teenager. And he was an interesting character. All the money that he made, such that he did make from the film, was held in trust until he was 21. But he did have this air of something special about him because he'd been in this film, and everybody told him how good the film was and how good he was and how cute he was. I think that he had a bit of the the devil inside of him when he was growing up. So that's my personal connection. I taught the Antichrist, is what I can claim right now. Antichrist wasn't very good at geography, was okay at maths, was disturbingly good at science. But enough of that. Let's come on to what we're going to talk about. And the first thing to really get our heads around is there's a fancy word for what we're going to talk about, and that fancy word is eschatology. Um, if we're studying the end times or the study of last things, then we're really looking at eschatology from the Greek word meaning last or final, and ology being the study of. I've got an ology. Um, and we see this idea of the end of things, or Armageddon, or the ending of civilization, repeated in a lot of films, in a lot of stories and memes or whatever. But it is a genuine study, and it is a study of what people believe happens at the end of times. Now, eschatology differs from prophecy because prophecy is about things that are possibly going to happen, but eschatology is about things that happen at the end. And the question really is it the end of all time, or is it the end of yourself? And one of the things I think is really interesting about this is that we all have lived a life, and we all, as we get older, realize that, um, maybe we're not going to live forever. And we do start to get a sense of the end of things. So it's about, you know, um, what do we mean by that ending, and what do we mean by our ending personally, and what do we mean by the world's ending? Now, of course, the geologist in me is going to tell you that the world is going to end, full stop. The very least that's going to happen, or the very worst that's going to happen at the end of our times is the sun is going to turn into, go a bit supernova and turn into a red dwarf, probably. Um, and in doing so, will boil away the atmospheres of all the planets in the solar system. But on another scale, coming back to a smaller scale, geologically, we are in a period of the Earth's history that's known as an interglacial. We are between ice ages, and we know climate change is a real thing, man-made or not. It is a real thing. We see it happening. And of course, human beings have this propensity to sit back and look at the changes in the earth and the changes in the universe or the cosmos and not see them for what they are. They're natural changes. And there will be a time when humankind ends up as some layer of strata in future rocks yet to be laid down. And what we become, well, that depends upon our evolution and our pathways. A number of years ago, that you may or may not know this, but geologists study the layers of rock, and the oldest ones are generally at the bottom, unless the rock's been turned upside down, and that's called stratigraphy. And there is a stratigraphical series of conventions how you name rocks. So you've heard of terms like Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous. These are the names of eras, geological eras in sequence. And as we've got closer towards human time, those eras have been measured as even smaller and smaller increments. Well, a number of years ago, the International Stratigraphical Conference decided that there was sufficient evidence in a layer of rock to indicate that something on the planet geologically had changed. Now, when we were in the Ice Age, it was called the Pleistocene period. Because that's what was going on in terms of climate, in terms of landforms. But these geologists decided that there's now a sufficient layer of material caused by human activity, particularly non-biodegradable plastics and things like that, to form a geologically labelable epoch, or strata of rock, which they euphemistically called the Pleistocene period. But actually, that's a scary thought for me as a geologist, knowing that human activity is already being, and this is the whole of human history, so is being written in the layers of the rock. Now we know archaeologists deal with layers of rock and old civilizations and things, but the fact that geology talks about ending of species and civilizations and changing global conditions. So there is an end to this, not just this talk, but actually this planet and this Earth. A lot of people debate about when it's going to happen and if it's going to happen. And so, if we talk about end of time beliefs, which is what we really want to talk about, the shall we say the spiritual religious ideas about that, then we can find that these belief systems come in a series of groups or patterns. First of all, we have the linear time, beginning, middle, and end, which tends to be a very Western thing because all of our time is linear. So there was a time when the Earth came into being and a time when the Earth will cease being. More Eastern traditions have this concept of cyclical time, okay? That there's a time when the Earth came into being, when it will age and when it will pass, and when it will come into being again. So end of time beliefs have one or the other of these particular concepts about them. The other thing is some people will say that they believe in a catastrophic single event, hellfire from the gods and above cascading down and destroying the earth completely, whereas some spiritual religious beliefs have a more gentle idea. It's going to be progressively transforming until we actually blow ourselves up or lead to our own demise by very steady, gradual, incremental measurements. And then, of course, there's the difference between divine intervention, that is, God or some divine force is going to do it, or are we going to have human caused endings, which I think is really interesting as a topic. And then, are they going to be renewal versus destruction? Are there going to be reformations or annihilations? And that I think is interesting too. If we look at geological history, just for a moment, we can see that cyclical time comes in and progressive transformation comes in. We can see there are human caused changes in environment, and then we can see that there's renewal and destruction going on at the same time. But spiritually, we often find that beliefs can be one or the other. They're bipolar in that sense, and people sitting in the middle tend to be the minority, whereas some people will be preaching hellfire and brimstone because their spiritual tradition teaches that, or they'll be talking about we're gradually moving towards the end, or the end is near and has been since the 1840s or whatever. So when you think of the end of times, what is it that you think of? Do you think of disaster and hellfire and brimstone and raging comets collapsing into the earth, like the comets that maybe that's caused the dinosaur extinctions, or are you thinking more of we're gradually walking to our doom now, my friend, in the things that we're doing and the things we're believing and how we're acting? So, what I wanted to try and do is very quickly explore some traditions of the end of times because they exist in every spiritual tradition. Yeah. In the Jewish tradition, most of this work obviously comes from the Old Testament. That's the Jewish Bible. We find that they're talking about the idea in Daniel's version of the Bible, there are four kingdoms and ancient of days and resurrection because of that. Isaiah talks about new heavens and new earth. We're going to talk about it in a moment. The book of Ezekiel talks about Gog and Magog, the sort of the holy and the unholy. And then there are also in the book of Zechariah, there are references to messianic age predictions, the coming of a Messiah. Now, one of the things that I found really interesting when I first got my head around it a bit is that coming from a Christian background, um, we were taught that the Messiah was the Jesus character that came to change and bring about a new level of awareness and spirituality. But in the Jewish traditions, they also had messiahs and messianic traditions, and they were preaching the same kind of thing, that they were becoming a world teacher or whatever it would be. And for that reason, Christianity and Judaism can sit quite comfortably together in some of these broader concepts, maybe not the details, but broader concepts. Um, so the idea within Jewish eschatology is that there will be coming with a now I'm going to pronounce this badly, a Mashiach or Messiah. Um, it'll be the bringing together of all the Jews that were exiled from the countries. It will be rebuilding the third temple in Jerusalem. These will all be signs of the coming of the Messiah. The dead will be resurrected, and there will be universal peace and knowledge of God. And depending on whether you're a conservative Jew or a Reform Jew interpreter, Judaism interpreter, the exact interpretation of all this would be slightly different. But the key point here is there is the coming of somebody, an individual in this particular case, who is going to bring about the change. Um, and that change can actually be one of greater spirituality and awareness and peace and acceptance and all that nice stuff. The Jewish literature, again, I'm only putting this up here for you to, if you want to follow it through, look it up, but if you look at some of the texts, the Book of Enoch, Ezra, and Baruch, that's where you're going to find a lot of references to the apocalypse. We also know that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, these wonderful set of scrolls that were found at a place called Nag Hammadi in the 1940s, which were tracts or books of writings that come about in the early tradition of Jewish teaching and the Christian Church. We talk about there was a war scroll and and the idea of community rule, and there was a group of Jewish scholars who were taking a very rationalist approach to the perspective of the end of the world. It was gradual change and enlightenment. However, if you looked at any Kabbalah, within the Jewish Kabbalah, there are concepts of the end of time and the idea tikkun olam and the idea of cosmic repair, which is cyclical. It's that cosmic destruction, cosmic renewal. Excuse me, I have a slurp. Now, I'm totally aware that a lot of this has got lots of biblical stuff in it, but I don't tend to delve too deeply into the specifics of this biblical literature. But I would invite you to have a read of it if this topic interests you, because it's this that really, I think, got me thinking about what do we mean by the apocalypse? What do we mean by Armageddon? And hopefully, I'll introduce some things to think about. Now, in Christian um, thinking, the New Testament, we find that the New Testament talks about the end of times in three of the Gospels. We find it in Paul's writings. Now, Paul, as you know, I think Paul was the guy that took the Jewish writings and turned them into something more palatable for the Roman Empire and beyond. You have a reference in Peter about the day of the Lord, and which is actually suggesting that the Lord will come and take back or open up a path to salvation. Bearing in mind, of course, that the Old Testament already has an Armageddon story in it that you know, whether you are Jewish or whether you are Christian, and that is the story of Noah's flood, when God decided to destroy the evil world and start again, and then say that he wasn't going to destroy it anymore, because leave us to ourselves, kind of thing. But then there were some teachings of Jesus, particularly if you are a follower of that particular mindset, that Jesus himself was saying, there is a time that of the end coming. Um, there is a time that there will be this great, um, if you like, rebirth, um, in the light of the Lord. And of course, his sacrifice, if you're a Christian follower, the sacrifice of Jesus was about the heralding of a potential for new age, hence New Testament, hence new beginnings. One of the books in the New Testament that I've always loved is the book of Revelation, and everybody will quote this book of Revelation as um, being the 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 book that talks about the end of the world. It is the most complex and disputed New Testament book. It's heavily symbolic and draws upon Old Testament images. It has a numerous interpretations, and basically it's a series of lessons and prophecy and apocalypse um, in it, that make it kind of heady read, and the kind of material that will have inspired art, did inspire art and music, and um, many, 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 many horror movies. Um, I don't know how much you're into your uh, sort of classical rock, heavy rock, or progressive rock, but you may remember a band called Aphrodite's Child, whose lead singer was Demi Roussos. Yes, he was a heavy rocker, and the keyboard player was Vangelis. And I came across these guys in the 70s, yeah, and um, they wrote an album based upon the Book of Revelation, and the songs were based upon the leading horse is white, and all that. And it was fantastic because it was well researched, um, imagery and poetry, and great progressive rock music. Now, what we need to bear in mind with the Book of Revelation is it is so easy to take most apocalyptic texts completely out of context. The book of Revelation, which was attributed to John, the Apocalypse of John, it's almost certainly not the same John who wrote the Gospels. And actually, if you read John, by the way, the Gospel of John, that's quite mystical in many places. But it's probably not the same John. Written about 90 years after Jesus' death, and it was written potentially under the Emperor Nero, some would believe, or under the Emperor Domitian, when the Romans were doing pretty terrible things to the Jewish population and many, many others. And one of the ways to read the book of Revelation is to see it not as the end times of future generations, but as the end times of the coming of the empire and what would destroy the Roman Empire. So when you look at it, and I would really, I'd really like, yeah, just enjoy it because it's a great book. You know, um, we find all kinds of references that have survived and filtered into popular culture. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are there. There are seven seals which, as they're opened, releases a new ill upon society. And there we find the number of the beast, 666. And of course, if you saw the movie The Omen, you realise that poor old Damien Thorne or Harvey Stevens had a tattoo on his head that was in the shape of three sixes. The real lad didn't have it, I don't think. But I'm joking about that. I never looked at his head that closely. But numbers and numerology was very symbolic to the Jewish people and to the early Christian people. So, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples. There were 10, which was the number of completeness, which is why the 10 commandments are there, not the 12 that really do exist in texts. And 144,000 was the number that you will hear many people, particularly Jehovah's Witnesses, quoting as being those that are going to be rescued and go to heaven when the rapture comes. And of course, 12 times 12 times 1,000 is 144,000. And so that is complete salvation. It's if 12 is God's people and 10 is completeness, therefore you multiply those numbers together in that pattern, that's why it's 144,000. 666 is a number that actually falls short of perfection, which is actually 777. So 666 could be the number of us, men, women, people, because we're not perfect yet. And 777 is the number achieving perfection. And I could spend ages on this, but this idea of numbers and numerology, or as the Jewish people called it, gematria, having inner meaning and significance that we've lost now. So we just take the quote 144 souls will be going along to into the afterlife while the rest of us are just resurrected. That 144,000 has a specific context, and we miss it. In the book of Revelation, we hear about Babylon the Great, or the whore of Babylon. And if you're into your Aleister Crowley, you know that Aleister Crowley played a lot with 666, the number of the beast, and the whore of Babylon. And if you look at the mythology there, it's not quite as some horror stories tell you. There's said to be a big battle at a place called Megiddo. Megiddo was a town just outside of Jerusalem. And Megiddo, we now know as Armageddon. So the Battle of Armageddon isn't Armageddon the end of the world, it's the battle of all battles. And then we read in the book of Revelation that the Antichrist or descendants of the Antichrist will reign for a millennium, and then there'll be salvation. And afterwards, New Jerusalem will come about. Not sure how, but it will come about. So the book of Revelation had a lot to say about the end of times. And it's if you treat it as a piece of poetry, and if you go back and look at Aphrodite's Child's album and know that they're singing about the leading horses being different colours, even if you don't like that kind of rock music, you can see how the poetry in this particular book influenced culture greatly. I was just saying before we came on that I've got into trying to write a few stories, and some of the ghost stories I'm writing are really inspired by M.R. James because I just love the way that guy wrote his ghost stories. But I also like Terry Pratchett. I know completely different. And so I was looking at Terry Pratchett's way he writing stuff, and I thought, well, he wrote a lot about, you know, sorcerers and witches and wizards and times. So I wonder what would happen if the four horsemen of the apocalypse had at least one new rider to ride with them, and that would be misinformation. Yeah, there's a possibility there for a great story. The five horsemen of the apocalypse, you know, the four traditional ones plus misinformation. So in Christianity, we're going to move away from the formal Judaic religions a minute. We talk about Christ is returning before 1,000-year reign of the Antichrist or the unlawful or the ungodly. Well, it's been 2,000 years. So what was that all about? Of course, the year 2000 has problems. And there's the idea that Christ is going to come back. Christ resembling the end of things as we know it and the beginning of something new, where he establishes a church in the new kingdom. There's the idea that actually in the Christian teachings, millennium is a symbolic, spiritual, not literal judgment. So all that hysteria around the year 2000, which some of you may remember was there, um, it's symbolic rather than 2000 and year 3000 and so on. I tend to think that many of the prophecies in the Christian text, particularly Revelations, where they were fulfilled by 70 years, um, 70 years after the birth of Christ, um, because that's when Jerusalem was destroyed. And I think that the writers that were writing Revelation and some of the texts were writing about an end of times within their historical future, maybe. There are some people that believe that all the prophecies are not yet fulfilled, they're going to be fulfilled. And the other thing is that people believe that prophecy is going to unfold through church history and the change of the church. Now, those fancy words there are just ways of describing what I've just said. Um, you may have an opinion on those, you may not. You may not have thought about it before, but this is all there for you to explore should you wish to. From about the early 19th century, mid 1800s onwards, there was this idea of the rapture, and we've heard lots about it um, in modern thinking. The idea that the rapture will come and descend, and it will suck up with it the people that are deserving of being in the presence of the Lord. And there are lots of views on that. There's the idea that before there is the trumpet call from heaven, those people will be ascended to some glorious heaven because they prepared for it. And so as this starts to end time starts to unfold, these people will be taken up into heaven. Some people will be taken up into heaven or whatever that is during the tribulations that follow, and some will wait to see the destruction of everything and they'll go up afterwards. If you want to follow up this rapture doctrine, which I particularly, for the moment, put in a kind of evangelical area of my mind. The main references come in Thessalonians, and you can have a look at that if you want to. But in popular culture, we know that that story of people vanishing and disappearing, and there's a television series called Left Behind. All those people that were left behind after the rapture had happened, after their loved ones, who were particularly holy, had ascended into heaven. There is a film with I think it's John Cage in it, where people vanish off an aeroplane, vanish. His wife vanishes, and he can't work out why he and his son are there. But his daughter and his wife have gone. Well, his daughter and his wife were particularly holy and went to the right church or whatever. Many denominations, Christian denominations, actually reject the rapture theology because it creates all kinds of problems, doesn't it? It creates this problem about who is going to be selected and who isn't going to be selected and why they're going to be selected, and do you have to go to a particularly happy clappy church in order to be part of the 144,000? I know when I've spoken to people that are into rapture, and we have a serious discussion, and again for Jehovah's Witnesses, I think it is, that my question is, of all the races of people, 144,000 are going to go into heaven, which are some of the prophecies. My question is often, which of the 12 tribes of Israel are going to go? Because that's what it referred to. It didn't refer to Gentiles and other folks. So if you do a check through Christian and Judaic or references about the signs of the end times, they're these, right? The Christian view is that there are wars and rumors of wars. Hello, guys, we're there. We see false messiahs and prophets. I think we've seen some of them. We have gospel preached to all nations. Well, we're not far off that. We have 7 years of trials and tribulations, which is, when God is dispensing his or her wrath, or the Antichrist is dispensing his or her tricks. We have the desolation of the rebuilt temple. We have cosmic signs, darkened sun, the blood moon, and we have moral decline and rejection of religious values, and then the return of the Jews to Israel. All of these have been listed as signs of the end of times, the thing that we're going to move into as a group of people if you follow Christian teaching or Judaic teaching. Of course, the biggie for Christians is the second coming. Christ's return in glory, the judgment of the living and the dead, and the resurrection and transformation of believers, and so on. The defeat of the Antichrist and Satan. That's a really interesting idea. We could talk about Antichrist and Satan. I don't think they're the same thing, but they are often conflated in people's spiritual belief systems being the same thing. And then you have all these different denominations of Christianity, for example, disputing and debating what that actually means. What does the second coming mean? I remember talking to to a group of people of particular faiths, and asking the question, if Jesus did come back, which is what the second was about, would he come back as a Jew or a Christian or a Buddhist or something else? Because potentially those old paths have been tried. As you can imagine, with a group of believers, that was quite a contentious issue. I think I got out fairly unscathed, but it's a thing to think about. In terms of Islam, which Islam is one of the Bibles, one of the books of the original books of the it descends from the old books of the Old Testament. Islamic eschatology talks about a day of judgment, talks about the hour of judgment and the signs. It mentions trumpet blasts, which you can find in Isaiah and you can actually find in Revelation. It talks about bodily resurrection, which I think is very interesting. The concept of, is it a bodily resurrection or is it a spiritual resurrection? It talks about balance, weighing of deeds, and as a bridge between the heaven and hell, or paradise and hell descriptions. One of the things that I'm not going to dwell on here, but is worth thinking about, is the idea that of, particularly in Muslim thinking, there are a group of Muslims that will actually believe that the holy war and martyring themselves is the quickest way to getting to their version of heaven. And if that's what they believe fundamentally, how we as a civilization can talk about that in any meaningful way is a real challenge, especially to those people that have been the victims of what we would call terrorist actions. I also I'm also interested in that quote I found there, that whereas particularly Christian tradition talks about either leaving people in the soil, or leaving them on to decay and rot. Certain chapters in Islam talk about the Prophet saying, Allah will torture the people who tortured people in this world. Interesting, because again, we're into language here, and we're into how people interpret language. And again, that's a topic for something else. I'm just trying to present what different people are saying about the end times. In Islamic and Muslim tradition, you have these particular bits of literature. I'm not going to go into each of them, but just to point them out to you, where ISIS, for example, have taken their views from particular sections of their book, their holy book. Um, we have the idea that the Sunni and the Shia have different versions of the end of the world. The idea that the Shia are looking for the 12th Imam, the 12th leader, that will actually then bring about the end of times. But the reason I'm pointing these out to you to have a look at, if you choose to, is that we may well know some of the texts of the Christian tradition or the Jewish tradition, but do we know the text that the Muslim tradition calls upon? And the thing that I find fascinating is when you really look at some of this stuff, there is a huge similarity. There are areas of agreement in all of the texts. And I just think it's a shame that we can't accept those things that we agree upon, um, and then try to work on understanding those things we disagree upon. So, in the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Jerusalem is central to everything. It's always mentioned. The idea of Gog and Magog, the 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 good and the bad, or the good priest and the bad priest, across all traditions. There's a resurrection and final judgment times, and the Mount of Olives, or the Temple Mount, also has a great significance in all of those traditions. And that's what I was saying a moment ago about the fact that there is so much similarity. It's a shame that those can't become the focal points of discussion or upon which to base discussion rather than the differences, because the differences are immediately going to cause argument and division. Um, okay, this looks like a really complicated diagram, and it probably is. I found it, I thought this makes sense. So I'm not expecting to go through it right now, but if you get this later on, you can have a look at it. Um, there are the Abrahamic traditions lined up and looking at some of the ideas about present times and some of the ideas about the end times, some of the ideas about messianic times, and then cometh the hour, what can we see or what will be there, and then the afterlife, what does that really mean? The afterlife, I think, is a particularly interesting one because uh, what do each of these traditions actually say about it? The Christian tradition is that there'll be some angelic blowing of horns, and the dead will arise, and a certain number will be taken off into heavenly paradise, and the others may be left on a new earth. I don't know. It's worth thinking about, but the hour is announced in each of these traditions by Gabriel blowing his horn. Um, and so the idea about um, people will get this uh, trumpet sound for the hour of the end. And prior to that, everybody will be suffering severe afflictions. There we go. And then we will find that some messianic figure, Jesus in particular, may make an appearance. Now, you've got to remember that Jesus was considered as a prophet by the Muslims, so it's no surprise that Jesus figures here in some teachings. Um, but a Messiah in Jewish tradition isn't Jesus, it's some other character. And of course, there is the idea of the Antichrist, or just evil, the sense of evil. Um, I find the Antichrist an interesting concept, again, not because I taught Damien Thorne, but because what that character represents in the various traditions. And maybe that's the topic for some other time. So have a look at that, and maybe it tries to put into context some of the things we've been talking about. Now, the thing that I will mention before I move out of the Middle East and out of Christianity into other things is that there are certain geographical focal points um, in all three of these Abrahamic traditions. And I find it fascinating that there are modern tensions in those three areas. which have, well, ever since 1967 or maybe before, really, um, became the point at which people started to talk about it's the end times. And if we look at a map, you know, um, we look at the map on the left, which shows the various kingdoms that existed within uh, the area of the Middle East. And they lived in the way that the tribes would have done. But that's on the left is the kingdom of Israel. Um, and also in the Old Testament, there are some other places that we talk about. And you might be forgiven for noticing that the geography of the places we're hearing about conflict now, and conflict that hopefully has come to some kind of end, um, you can see here. On the map on the right, you can see Megiddo, uh, picked up there, um, close to some of the places that you may recognize. Um, and I think for me, if the Middle East, particularly, and the sort of East generally, is the birthplace, sort of Africa and the East are the birthplace of civilization, and it kind of makes sense that the end place of civilization is in the old world too. I don't know. Um, I'll leave that to you to think about. Again, quick summary of signs and portents. We're going to look for the Mahdi, the guided one, or the return of Isa Jesus to Damascus. Or we're going to look at the false Messiah or the Antichrist coming forward. Again, Gog and Magog. We'll look at the beast of the earth, the Dabat al-Ard in Islam, the sun rising from the west, smoke covering the earth, and three major land collapses. So if any of those things happen in the next couple of months, I should double your life insurance and see what you can do with that. Now, Eastern traditions are interesting because they have a slightly different perspective on cosmic endings. They see them more as cyclical rather than linear. And that makes sense because if karma, rebirth, reincarnation are part of some Eastern teachings, it makes sense that they're there as there is an end, then there's a new beginning, an end, and a new beginning. And in Hinduism, again, we've got this idea there's a cycle of ages. They talk about the four ages, we're kind of in the current age of Kali, which is darkness, but four ages. And each age is about 432,000 years. Yeah. So Kali Yuga, the one we're in, is actually identified by moral decline, shortened lifespans, and materialism. I kind of think that describes where we're at. One complete cycle of those four ages is 4.32 million years, which is interesting in terms of a number, because what was happening 4.32 million years ago, as far as human beings are concerned? Have a think about that. The the final incarnation, in terms of this philosophy, is all to do with the major avatars appearing, the major divine people coming back, and they begin a new golden age. It will destroy evil and restore Dharma, kind of cycle of birth, death. And so each Sata Yuga, the golden age, will actually announce the next beginning of the next four cycles. So it's a final incarnation. Here, concept of heaven and hell is not the same as in the Abrahamic traditions. It's something completely different. And again, you can look at this, but there's the idea of we have these sort of deities that bring about the turning of the wheel. Shiva is the destroyer and the creator of times, and she dances the Tandava dance. And the Tandava dance is spiraling out and around of time. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful kind of ideas. The idea the universe dissolves back into Brahman, Brahman, the first source, and therefore Brahman can give birth to it again. Uh, Vast cosmic rest. One of my favorite magicians, this sounds like I'm changing the subject, but I'm not, entertaining magicians, although he was other things as well, is a gentleman called Eugene Berger. I was fortunate enough to meet him and work with him a few times. He has passed now, um, but he performed a beautiful magic routine with a piece of cotton thread, which he ripped into pieces, and then all the pieces were rolled together in his fingertips, and they all rejoined. Beautiful, and in that he told the story of the birth and the death and the rebirth of time, the Tandava dance, and Shiva dancing a dance to transform. And when I saw him perform this, I suddenly realized that this guy was not only a deep thinker, but he was a prophet. And I mean that literally, because he took ideas that were so deep within our personality and our psyche and wove a visual story around it that made it make sense to even people who weren't Hindu. So if you get a chance to look up Eugene Berger online and look up his yellow cotton thread, and when he talks about that, just stunningly beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I've gone off on a tangent. I'm sorry about that. In Buddhism, right? Okay, we have the same kind of idea of six cycles. The idea that there's three periods after the great Buddha's death: the true Dharma, lasting 1,000 years. We have the imitation Dharma. People think they're enlightened and they're not. And then we have which the current year we're living in, the day of Dharma. And it's a gradual deterioration of teaching and practice. Now, I'm not going to get too hung up on this, but if you've studied anything to do with modern New Age teaching, we can find that certain spiritual traditions that have been borrowed, stolen, misappropriated, have been diluted in the doing so of them. For example, I'm going to take Reiki as an example. Now, Reiki is a energy healing, I'll use that word carefully, art that modern practitioners allow you to come and have a bit of Reiki and come and get zapped, and they'll do their kind of 3 levels of Reiki, and they'll do their kind of training in Reiki and and they switch it on and switch it off. Actually, Mikei Usui, who developed Reiki, didn't wasn't talking about that, I believe. Usui was a lay Buddhist. He was a Buddhist gentleman who went to search enlightenment and spent time in a cave. And when he came down from the cave, it has been reported that he was instantly enlightened. Well, I don't think he was. When he came down from the cave, he actually had formulated a practice, and he taught that practice. And one of the byproducts of that practice was the ability to cause feelings of well-being in others. And so he never taught it as a healing art. Healing was a byproduct of actually self-development. Okay, so now you get people that want to do their Reiki 1, 2, and 3 and become suddenly Reiki masters in 3 months. That's not what it worked. In fact, Usui never taught level 1, 2, and 3. It was Usui's, shall we say, subsequent teachers who brought it to the West who told the story differently. They said that Usui was actually a Christian theologist person who received the information about how to heal, and he taught it in 3 levels, 1 to 3. That was simply because of the way that happened when it moved to America. And we've all inherited that system, anybody who does Reiki. So when I try and share Reiki with people, I don't teach it as 1, 2, and 3. Maybe I have to because the Reiki Federation says we do it that way. But the reality is, it's about self development, it's about self attunement. And then being part of that consciousness maybe makes you have a clarity of thought where you can support others. It's not about becoming a Reiki master online for 200 quid and having attunements that you've never met the teacher. It's an initiatory tradition. And the reason I've gone off about here is we actually see that imitation of something and that deterioration of teaching and practice. The idea of master to student and student back to master and so on. And so, because that teaching has been deteriorated, we have people wandering around, you know, Sabrina Moonstone doing New Age festivals suddenly is enlightened about everything because they've been on a weekend fire walking course in South Wales. I don't know. But these people, the pseudo enlightenment is there, which again, if you want to think about it, harkens back to what we said earlier about the end times. Um, so, Buddhism has this idea of cyclical time, but it's about decay before rebirth. And the appearance of the Maitreya, um, which is the idea that when everything is nearly lost, this new teacher will appear and connect again. It's not a messiah as such, it's a new teacher who is currently hanging about to shit to heaven uh, and is waiting to bring enlightenment to the world, but the people have to be ready for that enlightenment to happen. So that's Buddhism in a nutshell, or that part of it. Nearly gone through this list of other people's beliefs about the end of the world. Zoroastrianism, I find is fascinating. I don't know a tremendous amount about it, or I didn't. I'm starting to understand it more. But Zoroastrians um, could possibly be among some of the oldest traditions, alongside Hinduism, of spirituality, and they have certain ideas which are listed. I'm not going to read this stuff for you, but this idea of ordeal and trial and resurrection of the dead, and really Zoroastrianism had a major influence on early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam because it's all there. And that then brings me to this quick point about if we're not aware enough to honor our sources, then we're not aware enough to understand there is an origin to these things. And the origin, as if on the first stories that were ever told by human beings. And they're the first religious stories that got changed and turned into spirituality, turned into religious dogma, and the dogma started to lose the message. Zoroastrianism also links to Mithras, the origins of Mithras. So again, maybe worth having a look at Zoroastrianism. I had some friends that were Zoroastrians. They were interesting. Yeah, it's another story, but yeah, I would say they were quite balanced folk, and they had a certain kind of attitude to life and living that I think many would benefit from these days. So this is East and West comparisons. On the Western side of things, we have that transformation, individual salvation, historical fulfillment. It's linear and divine intervention. On the eastern side, we have that cyclical time. There are recurring cycles. There's cosmic regeneration. There are timeless principles, and there's natural law, karma. And we're living in a time now, I think, where various spiritual teachings are all in a big melting pot, which is not a problem, except the melting pot, like with Reiki, doesn't honour the tradition from which it evolved. And because it doesn't do that, it's lost something of its vitality. Okay, nearly there. The indigenous peoples, of course, also have an end times set of beliefs. And I think this is the key message from this. Whatever you personally believe about apocalypse and end times, we have to recognize that the ideas, the stories exist in almost every culture because the end of times um, interests all of us and all the stories we've told about it. So we know about the Mayan long calendar and how, in fact, the Mayan calendar stopped in 2012. Well, yeah, not quite, but that's brought about the 2012 phenomenon. We know that there's the Maya perspective of completion of cycles, not the world ending. We know about the Bacton cycles within indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica. Well, the last one ended in, say, 2012. We know about the idea that various world ages were created and destroyed. In terms of the Aztecs, we're in the fifth sun, so that's the fifth recreation, and there's a prophecy of Quetzalcoatl's return. And we're also in this idea that these stories are enshrined in ancient sites like Itza, Palenque, and Teotihuacan, of which I've got an interesting story about, but that'll have to wait because I'm going on a bit. Native American traditions also have their own um, eschatology stories. There's the 9 signs before the day of purification, white man's arrival, spinning wheels, wagons, cattle, iron snakes, railroads, a giant spider web, stone rivers, sea turning black, youth with long hair, horses in the sky. There we go. That's the 9 signs before the day of purification. So according to some Native American traditions, we're there. White man has arrived. We've got wagons. We've got cattle. We've ordered cattle. We've got railroads. We've got power lines across the world and internet across the world. We've got stone rivers, highways. We've got the sea turning black. We've got youth with long hair. And we've got a house in the sky, a space station. And the challenge again is what began as Native American story traditions and allegory suddenly gets tied down to something very firm. Well, I'm not sure it's meant to have been. The Hopi Blue Star Kachina philosophy. Prophecy is when the Kachina and the Blue Star of Kachina comes back to the earth. We've got the Lakota prophecy of the white buffalo calf woman who's returning, and I'm only pointing this out. You can look this stuff up. We have Cherokee predictions of cleansing times, and then we have the great law of peace from the Iroquois and the future predictions of nations. And Native American traditions particularly have fascinated me because um, their their connection with nature and nature cycles and their current connection, I think, certainly indigenous peoples, to their stories make them for, I think, very interesting people to look towards for these kind of things. And then, we can't miss out the you can't miss out the kind of Europeans, the Norse eschatology. There's a 3-year winter without summer. That's going to be mark the ending. There'll be a breaking of all bonds and oaths, yeah. And then Fenrir, which is the wolf that was tied up by the Norse gods, escapes and devours Odin, and the Midgard serpent emerges from the ocean as a battle on the Vigrid plain, and then death of the major gods Odin, Thor, Freya, Heimdall. If you've seen the Marvel movies, you know this stuff, right? It's there. And then there's a new Earth arriving, and the surviving gods return, and Balder is resurrected. And of course, the sources from this is the poetic stuff of the Norse peoples. Some beautiful stuff. As I say, some of it is dealt with fairly interestingly in the Marvel stories. A lot of it is actually made into something twee and not very interesting at all. Okay, so let's sort of wrap this up because I've been going on. In terms of scholarly interpretations, we have what we can call the scientific ideas and technological ideas. climate change. Come on, that's happening. We have we know about the asteroid impacts of Tunguska in 1908 and Chelyabinsk in 2013 and what happened there. Um, we're it could well be that in the not too distant future, some kind of asteroid will bump into us and we'll go, ow. Um, if you've seen the movie, I think it was 2012, super volcanoes in Yellowstone caused massive climate changes. Um, I've been to Yellowstone, and it's pretty amazing that you're standing on part of the Earth that really is ready to explode. I mean, geologically, it's ready to go. Then there's a gamma ray burst from space, or the solar death. Say, I mentioned before, 5 billion years time, and then of course we've got the technological threats. I joked about the fifth horseman of the apocalypse being misinformation, but there's there. But we've got nuclear war and winter scenarios. They're sort of getting kind of like scarily close in place. Artificial intelligence, does it possess an existential risk? Is it suddenly going to become smarter than us and turn us off? Um, Biotechnology engineered pandemics. If you read some conspiracy theorists, we're already there. Nanotechnology and the grey goo scenario. The grey goo is the fact that we can create all these little miniature robots that form like a goo, and this goo then can actually spread. And because it's nanotechnology, it can become whatever it wants to become. If you've seen the Day the Earth Stood Still, the Keanu Reeves version, not the more um, much the better version than the 1950s version, but the inferior Keanu Reeves version, about Grey Goo. And then transhumanism. Is there a point at which technology will transcend human ability and then it will lead to extinction? So again, this idea of end times exists not only in terms of spiritual texts and spiritual belief systems, but exists also within uh, technology and those scientists that sit down and think about these things, about how the world will end. And of course, we know that fiction, which is a mirror of our beliefs, actually represents things that we would, um, we think about. Yeah, about these. So we got the Book of Revelations had a cultural impact. Nostradamus' prophecies, which are interesting. If you've seen modern films like The Road, Mad Max, Children of Men, you'll know what that goes. We have zombie apocalypses as a modern myth. We have the Y2K technology fears, and fiction actually shapes our imagination much more than we think it does, and brings about discussion points about the ends of the earth. And lastly, the new age, the age of Aquarius. What the hell? Um, and I'm not going to take my clothes off and run around the stage, as in hair, but there is this idea that there's a planetary consciousness shift called the new sphere. There's the Mayan calendar pops up again. This idea of the harmonic convergence in 1987, and then you have this stuff about photon belt theories, ascension, dimensional shift concepts, galactic alignment theories, and integration of quantum physics terminology. Most of which, when quantum physics is applied to some new age thinking, it's BS. But the New Age interpretation is out there. You've only got to go to any New Age festival and you will hear somebody talking about the integrated Googleplex solar plexus interconnection with the third eye chakra and the ascended masters from wherever. I sound like I'm very dismissive of that. I am, because it's woo woo and it's fluffy, because these people haven't are not able to tie it down, but they may get great views on TikTok or whatever. And that's it.